Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name's Michael Fotheringham. I'm the Chief Executive of AHURI, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest event in our AHURI Research webinar series. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all working today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters throughout Australia. Now, AHURI is pleased to be able to offer this research webinar series as a means of keeping you informed of our latest research and to help you engage with research findings from our ongoing program of research activity. At a time when our public face-to-face conference and events program is, of course, still on hold. So today will be our 6th instalment in the series, and if you're interested in seeing any of the previous 5 webinars, the recordings are freely available on the AHURI website. Before we meet today's presenters and I introduce you to the topic for today's webinar, I want to just take a moment to introduce you to AHURI's National Cities Strategic Research Agenda, which officially launched a couple of weeks ago. As part of AHURI's strategic plan, we've committed to developing a program of research to explore the many issues facing Australian cities today, including expensive housing markets, extensive geographical sprawl, high carbon intensity and resource consumption, rapid population growth, changing transport needs, and of course, the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. It's our ambition to provide Australian cities and urban policy research with the same coordinated focus and engagement with the policy community and impact that we're already bringing to the housing and homelessness research area. The launch of this strategic agenda and our website hub is the first step in our journey to delivering a national cities research program. So I invite you to take some time to visit the new Cities and Urban Hub of the AHURI website. It showcases 12 key research themes that we've identified as either defining current cities policy in Australia to date, or that we believe should be considered in our policy focus as a nation moving forward. If your organisation is interested in partnering with AHURI to deliver a future cities research program, we'd invite you to contact us and start a conversation. Right, before I introduce today's topic and speakers, I need to just provide you with a few instructions on the software and some housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, so if you need to leave or you're getting distracted by homeschooling, those of us in Melbourne particularly, or for that matter, if you want to return to it later or forward it on to a colleague, the recordings will be available on the AHURI website in the coming days, as will the slides. At the end of today's webinar, you'll receive a survey, and we really do welcome your feedback so that we can refine and improve our future webinars to ensure we're presenting information in a way that's useful to you. Now, in terms of participating in today's webinar, some simple instructions. You're listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone from the audio pane in the dial-up, and the dial-up information will be displayed for you. You'll also have the opportunity to submit questions by typing them in the questions section of the control panel. You can submit your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll collate these and address as many of them as we can during the Q&A segment following today's presentation. But do please disregard the raise your hand function, as we can't use that in today's webinar. Now, today's topic and presenters. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. And I want to acknowledge the generous support of the Housing Industry Association, our exclusive sponsor of today's webinar. In supporting today's webinar, the HIA believe that maintaining housing supply in every part of the housing spectrum, from public to private, is the key to supporting access to safe, decent and affordable housing options for all Australians. And we thank them for their support. Our presenter today is Professor Robyn Dowling from the University of Sydney. She's the lead author of the AHURI report, Affordable Housing in Innovation-Led Employment Strategies, which is the basis for today's webinar. This study examines the role of affordable rental housing in supporting innovation-led employment growth in Australia's metropolitan and satellite cities. The research looks to solutions through a number of case studies of innovation district developments in both Australia and overseas. The report, along with a policy evidence summary and a standalone executive summary, is now available on the AHURI website. The address should be on your screen. Our speaker, Robyn Dowling, joined the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney in 2016, bringing with her a long-standing research in urbanism. Her current research is concerned with the ways in which urban governance and urban life are responding to climate change and technological disruption. Alongside this AHURI research, Robyn builds upon the foundations of urban planning to explore partnerships and complex relationships through which contemporary cities are governed, and most recently the notion of smart cities. We also welcome Adam Beck as a respondent following Robyn's research presentation. Adam's the Executive Director with Smart Cities Council, where he works with the world's longest running smart cities organisation, focused on catalysing investment in technology and data to accelerate livability, workability and sustainability. Adam holds advisory positions with Swinburne Smart Cities Institute and the University of Adelaide's Australian Smart Cities Consortium. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts on this research, Adam. But now it's my pleasure to hand over to Professor Robyn Dowling.
Great. Thanks, Michael. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm located this afternoon, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm at the University of Sydney. And I also want to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the collaborators on this research project and report. If you go to the AHURI website and find the report and the policy evidence summary, you'll see who those collaborators are. And I'm just speaking not on their behalf, but I'm bringing together all our work in this afternoon's presentation. If we go to the next slide, please. So essentially, there are three sort of terms that framed this report, which are all buzzwords in urban policy circles. So smart cities, you can't really go read any urban policy, urban planning conversations, participate in conversations internationally, nationally at the moment without hearing about smart cities. Innovation is a buzzword, both for economic development strategies for the federal government, for the state that I'm in New South Wales, innovation strategies, innovation districts of which I'm located in. We're trying to, foster innovation and employment and high-tech jobs, a whole series of different things that are happening. So it's yet another buzzword. And then affordable housing. Affordable housing might not have the buzziness of smart cities or innovation, but it really has a long history of policy traction, of policy attention, and a really important societal issue. So what this report did was actually try to bring those three terms together and try to think about their intersections, drawing on both Australian, international research and some really detailed work in particular parts of some Australian cities that I'll talk about. And so I'm just going to begin by giving some definitions, because the report takes a particular path through each of those words and defines them in particular ways, and then to come up with some conclusions. So next slide. So essentially, what I wanted to do is sort of just give you those definitions. So what we're interested in is really, I guess, innovation-led employment. The broad question was, we've got various new forms of technological disruptions, or not even disruptions, forms of technology that are generating new forms of employment clusters. And, how might we connect those to housing? So, which is why we use the term in the project innovation-led employment. So technology, communication could be advanced materials, advanced manufacturing, fintech, prop tech, all those techs that are transforming our cities and our daily lives in particular ways. And these forms of employment typically cluster in or around cities, Silicon Valley being the classic example of clusters of different forms of employment, sometimes with an anchor, whether it be Facebook, Google, etc., and a whole series of small firms around them. So we're interested in that's what we mean by innovation-led employment. Now, smart cities, and I'm sure Adam is going to comment on this in a lot more detail, given what his day job is, but is really as a researcher in the smart city space, I think about the diversity and the myriad of ways people define smart city. Smart city in some ways can be anything to many different people. But what we're interested in this research project was about the ways of the use of the digital technologies to address urban challenges. Often that is at local government level to underpin more efficient government, to provide better services. But it's also, and this is the way that we particularly focus on it in this report, is that the ways that the ideas of the smart city and digital technologies more broadly have been used to deliver economic development outcomes, and in particular employment outcomes. So it's like the pursuit of technological innovation for economic purposes. And if we think of some of the classic smart city examples in Australia, and again, I'm being New South Wales centric here, Newcastle is one of the leaders in the smart city space in Australia, and a critical element of that is to actually provide an innovation district of sorts, to provide innovation-led employment strategy. So yes, smart cities in Australia is about providing digital technologies that might empty our bins quicker, but it's also about sort of fostering new forms of employment for urban areas. So that's really what we're interested in the smart city space. And then finally, if we bring affordable housing into the equation. And in some ways, when we started this research, we had a sense in our heads of how these three concepts were connected. And the first critical finding was that, no one was talking about affordable housing when they're talking innovation, for example. It's like this housing, but what is the role of housing in innovation employment strategies? Does it provide opportunities for innovation? Does it provide barriers to innovation? So that's the questions, and which I've just put on the slide. Here is, are there possibilities for affordable housing through some of these strategies in smart city developments? Or on the other hand, are there barriers and issues that we need to think about? So that's really what the project was interested in doing. If we go to the next slide, please. So essentially, if I just quickly give you an overview of the findings, I'm just going to pick out a few of them today. So there is a sense in which classic innovation districts, innovation clusters, have historically been associated with declining housing affordability. So if we take Silicon Valley as an example, when we get a clustering of particular sorts of firms, we get demands for space, demands for certain sorts of employees, housing costs rise. That's the classic Silicon Valley story. So that at the moment, you hear Silicon Valley firms talking about they can't actually afford, they have trouble finding employees because they can't afford to live there. Or the other sort of way that we might think about affordable housing is that where tech firms cluster. So if I think about inner Sydney, for example, or parts of inner Melbourne, where the City of Melbourne's been doing some work, they cluster typically in areas where housing costs are high, partly because of the other amenities that are surrounding those areas, which I'll go into in a moment. So what we wanted to do was to think about, well, how might we think differently? Yes, that is certainly the case, but why don't we, if we turn the question on its head, where would we end up? So that's a first point, I guess. The second point is that what we found, and I'll give some examples, is that affordable and appropriate housing is actually important to technology startup businesses in particular, in both regional and inner urban places. The third thing we talked about is that Australia is not alone. So clearly, as a AHURI project, we're interested in Australian cities and regions. And as usual, we can learn from overseas. I would also argue that overseas can always learn from what's happening in Australia. But, there are in particular international models of what you could call inclusive innovation that really provide insight into how we might do innovation-led employment and affordable housing simultaneously, if you like. And finally, we were interested in particular because of the broader project that sort of scaffolded this particular research was, well, are there opportunities for regional and satellite towns to attract innovation? And in fact, not only opportunities, are they already? And I'll come back to that at the end. So I'll just quickly, in the next little while, touch on each of those. So next slide. I'm going to talk briefly about we did some work with firms, and by firms I actually mean startups. And startups, you know, small businesses, small sort of tech-focused firms, really trying to become the next Atlassian, for example. And we interviewed a range of startups from across Greater Sydney region, not just in where I'm located, but in Western Sydney and Wollongong as well, because that's really starting to develop startup cultures. It's estimated to be about 1,500 startups in Australia. There's an organisation called Startup Muster that does a great census, if you like, of startups most year. Most of the owners, entrepreneurs, are aged between 30 and 40, and they actually rely on the significant cash injections from the owners to survive. So housing, what we found, was not an obvious barrier or enabler to the activities of these firms, in contrast to a large firm that might have trouble finding employees if housing costs are too high. There was really no obvious sort of saying, well, I need affordable housing and I can't do what I need to do. But what we did find is that when you think about what the culture of an entrepreneur or the life of some of these entrepreneurs and the life stage of these entrepreneurs is that they're completely focused on the business. That's what it means to be a startup. So they pour all their available money, time and energy into the business. So that means that housing has to just suit that focus of everything has to work behind the scenes in order to focus on the business. So housing needs to be a facilitator of that energy. And what we found was that they obviously needed housing close to their business, it needed to be affordable, and it needed to be close to minimise commuting time. So they need housing close by because they just don't want time commuting. They need good digital connectivity so that they can work from wherever, and also physical connectivity in terms of being able to travel around the city, preferably not by car, although notably this was pre-COVID. So since I was focused on the business, housing was secondary, but they couldn't afford to pay much. And often what we found is they used informal networks to provide housing, especially in high-cost housing environments, whether that means living with friends, living with parents, using, having built up equity through previous employment, and then sort of living off having secure housing because as a base from which to launch their business. So it's like what I just wanted to, and also needed to be flexible. So often some of these schemes through which we get, the Smart City scheme, so that, we're going to have a hackathon, and if you win a prize, and we'll give you a mentor to be mentored to be an entrepreneur. Well, that might require them to move cities. And then it's like, well, what are they going to do for 6 to 8 weeks when they're in that city? Airbnb is probably not an affordable option. And what is it? What sort of co-living, co-working spaces might sustain that? So I guess the message there is housing was a hidden underpinning, if you like, of entrepreneurial activity. So they needed to sort their housing in order to focus on the business. And I find that was one of the more interesting parts for me of the report. Next slide. Then the question becomes, well, then if we have a more conventional innovation cluster, then, how might we have that more inclusive in terms of affordable housing? So we started to talk about this notion of inclusive innovation. It's not our notion, it's one that has been borrowed. And what the international evidence shows, and I've just summarised it on the slide, is that a focus on equity, more general, and diversity, which includes housing affordable, is a critical element that facilitates the skill sets that support sustainable innovation districts. So we know from a whole series of case studies across the last 15, 20 years is that innovation clusters need diversity. So they need diversity of cultures, of people, employment, of land use types, and therefore of housing. So that innovation needs lots of different sorts of people to collaborate, to work together, to build critical mass. And so there's some interesting cases, mainly in the US, some in Europe, but I'm just going to talk about the American ones, that really try to build inclusivity into their redevelopments in either central cities or in smaller places. So Boston, classic innovation place, and a really big leader in the smart city space as well. In there, well, 10 years ago, did a waterfront redevelopment project that included, trying to get major technology anchors and startups. But they included an innovative housing component to what they did, including, in this case, a 15% what they call micro units, to really have this affordable, flexible housing for people to come in and out of. They were supported by various other tax incentives, but it was about to say, look, if we're going to build this space, then let's incorporate housing at the outset. A somewhat more unusual example, in that I don't think Chattanooga is a classic innovation. If I said Chattanooga, perhaps people would think innovation. It certainly wasn't what I thought when I first started to think this one through. And what their innovation district was much more of what we would think of a smart city development. So they were talking about, becoming a gig city. So it's about, if we bring new forms of digital connectivity to the city, then we can actually bring new sorts of businesses, new forms of employment, and new forms, new migration into the city. So it's about this big revitalization of the city. And again, what the Chattanooga example is really quite interesting for was that there was a focus on equity at the outset. So it's certainly, yes, we need to give tax breaks, we need to get these forms of new employment, we need to have really good digital connectivity in the US case. But how might we support affordable housing through this process? So in that case, they used various local and land use tax breaks, but it was like saying, well, we want to do this development, but we need different forms of housing in order to support it. So I could go on with examples, but there's a sense in which, well, some of the more imaginative examples, classically, they might not be big cities. I know Cleveland, Ohio is a big city, but they're doing some really interesting inclusive innovation work, or Albuquerque. So it's about sort of thinking, well, in the US in particular, there's an attempt to take innovation beyond the conventional California or Boston. And how might we do that to understand that this is a very different context, and how can we build affordability into this? Next slide. So where that leads us, where it leads me at least, is to the US example in trying to shift away from the large conglomerations, is to think, well, are there therefore opportunities for regional and satellite towns in the Australian context for innovation-led employment and various other smart city developments that might also have quite interesting opportunities for affordable housing? So if I put the innovation lens on this, it's in some ways, this is about turning the question on its head. So rather than saying, how can we provide affordable housing where the jobs are, which would be what I just talked about, but the other way, and it's not novel at all to us, but the question is, why don't we move jobs to where the affordable housing is, or where the more affordable housing is? So, are there opportunities given the digital connectivity of regional Australia, given that some of our satellite towns were the first to get the NBN, for example, some of our satellite towns were the first to sort of participate in some of the IBM and Cisco smart city developments. Is it where we have these strong ideas to be digitally connected and digitally at the forefront of what's happening, and where there is more affordable housing than, say, in inner Sydney or Melbourne or even in Brisbane, other opportunities? So that's what we then did some interviews, principally in Western Sydney, then we did a case study of Geelong and some broader projects. And what the finding there was that there is certainly some opportunities, obviously, really, and there's some interesting things going on that, again, are incorporating affordability at the outset, to starting thinking about diversity of housing types, diversity of people, diversity of employment options. And there's just a couple of photographs there. So Tonsley in South Australia is an innovation and smart city development, is really trying to think about, well, how might we guarantee some affordable housing and inclusionary zoning. Geelong, pivot city of various other places around universities, classically trying to create this diversity of environment to attract employment, but also to attract different forms of housing. Or if I take the Western Sydney example, the Aerotropolis and various activities, I've said the Science Park in Western Sydney, is that there are sort of particular employment lands beyond the central city and either in outer suburban or regional locations where there are interesting things happening or opportunities where you can respond and incorporate housing early, mixed-use developments, cultural activity, etc., and digital connectivity. So there are some of these regional towns and satellite cities that are really quite at the forefront of these opportunities. So next slide. So essentially what that means, what we tried to do, and I haven't used many specific examples today, because essentially what we tried to draw out from sort of this extensive understanding of different places is that, well, what sort of urban and planning policy might we want to, start to think about? And the first one's actually quite simple, and it's really our starting point. Housing and innovation are linked. So it's not that you could do an innovation policy without thinking about housing. Obviously that happens, but that's probably not a desirable thing to do. And there are various innovation strategies that could be used. So it might be that you can use land use planning frameworks that support models of live-work zones. I know that is happening, but it's actually an important thing to think about, that fluidity of housing and employment that is quite important. How might we support that through the planning system? It could be that we could have strategic place-based funding interventions. Western Sydney City Deal being a classic example of that could prioritise connectivity, so physical and digital connectivity, to enable cities, firms to operate. I know in the Western Sydney City Deal, the scales of types of activity and advanced manufacturing is a little bit different, but it's a really good example of how we can have these different, collaborative arrangements that might support that. And there's standard urban planning frameworks just provide high quality amenities, local pedestrian cycle networks, good public spaces. That just never goes away as a way of what sort of spaces are we creating in our cities. And finally, there are a bunch of housing strategies that we could think about. Preserving and providing affordable rental housing remains a key challenge across these projects. But it might be that we think about, well, if you think some of those early career innovation sector workers or the startups that we spoke to, about how is it that we can provide flexible tenures, accessible locations and amenities all together, because we know that that's what is required. Maybe there is, again, it's a reaffirmation of renegotiating regulations and development incentives, whether that be through negotiating floor space ratios or height controls. But, what are some of the strategic tools to encourage the growth of diverse housing outcomes? And then other housing interventions that are often talked about, more difficult to implement, zoning options and taxation settings. So there's sort of the classic levers of affordable housing. And finally, to briefly to conclude, so the last slide, I just thought, so this research was completed before COVID, and I was talking to Michael beforehand. It does feel like, COVID-19 has been with us for quite some time, but this research predated that. But there are some really interesting ways that the lessons of COVID both affirm and perhaps challenge some of this research, and I wanted to put this out as a conversation. So, for example, there's been some research done in Silicon Valley where rents have actually declined by 7% since March. So perhaps making those more conventional innovation sites are becoming more affordable. Clearly, the jury is out on that. The Australian situation is very different at the moment. But, is it those what the classic clusters are having different housing dynamics. But also the experience of working remotely has actually opened up a whole series of new places in the Australian urban system from which people are working remotely and might actually be fostering various sorts of collaborations around technology. So there's many, I'm sure all of you have heard media stories of knowledge workers of various types fleeing large metropolises over the last few months and quite, establishing themselves in both conventional and unconventional places in order to work. The challenge and the classic thing about innovation-led employment is that collaboration is critical, and it's about how do you have that, and they also see not only collaboration but proximity, and it's a challenge. I think I'm just going to end with the challenge is about how do you create proximity in a virtual way, and I think if we can start thinking more carefully about that, then more innovation employment in regional and satellite cities will be more likely. Thank you.
Thank you, Robyn. That was a really, really interesting and insightful overview of the research you've done. I'd invite everyone to start putting through questions now using the question pane in the GoToWebinar application. And as you start to think through your questions or type them out, I'd also like to invite Adam Beck to reflect on the research and the presentation and its implications for the sector. Adam.
Michael, thanks so much for having me here, and Robyn, thank you so much for a truly stimulating not only presentation but in reading the report prior to this session. Let me make a few caveats first to my response, because that'll give some insights into sort of what's going through my mind. And I don't necessarily have any clear, articulate responses or recommendations, so bear with me with my stream of consciousness and the thought bubbles that came from reading the document. First of all, I'm a planner by training, but I gave that away a long time ago. So I still have a love-hate relationship with the idea of planning, urban planning, and I also did postgraduate in social planning. The other thing I'll say is that I lived in Portland, Oregon, the home of smart growth, and I did a lot of work in Silicon Valley, and indeed worked on the precise plan for the city of Mountain View, which is headquarters for LinkedIn and Google. So your report, Robyn, was bringing up a lot of old sort of experiences that I had firsthand. The other thing I'll say is I worked across a number of states in the US. So I had light fingerprints on the Boston Innovation District. One of my projects was Kendall Square as well. And I had the opportunity to work alongside and partner. I was working for a non-profit think tank when I was over there. I had the opportunity to work with the likes of enterprise community partners and also the Capitol Hill Housing organization up in Seattle as well. So I got some interesting exposure to how really good affordable housing is secured early prior to sort of innovation taking off. One thing I'll reflect on firstly is my personal experience when living in Portland. So I was in Portland. I was actually on the border of Portland and Beaverton, and Beaverton is the headquarters for Nike. And just beyond Beaverton in Hillsborough is the North American headquarters for Intel. And Portland's often known as Silicon Forest, Silicon Valley down in sort of California, Silicon Forest up in Oregon. And I saw firsthand the sort of organic evolution and impact of innovation-led growth, whether planned or unplanned. In the 3 years that I was living there, 2013 through 2016, I witnessed firsthand what was happening in the Bay Area and the impact it had elsewhere. So when the Bay Area was blowing up, or California and the Bay Area was blowing up, including Oakland, what they call the Silicon Valley overflow was making its way to Portland, Seattle, Denver, and Austin. So kind of all the startups and innovation companies were going there, predominantly because housing was cheaper there than it was pretty much anywhere. It's sort of in California at the time. But what we observed was there were three other major sort of pull factors that we found in Portland, Seattle, Austin, and Denver, and it's what I call the triple B factor, B for Bob, and that was bikes, beer, and burritos. So great sort of cycling infrastructure, percentage of craft breweries per capita. If it's high, that was a high pull factor, and then burritos, food trucks, outdoor living, and that type of sort of lifestyle. So as we sort of all know and read from the Brookings work, you know, place is absolutely fundamental in sort of allowing and attracting that kind of talent. And affordable housing seemed to be an element that was either in play or not. And I almost felt like, as a resident in one of those cities that was blowing up from innovation in Silicon Valley, I almost felt like there was a line in the sand, there was a date. If you weren't in the housing market or you hadn't secured some form of housing by a particular date, it was kind of gone, you'd lost it. You know, the momentum was so quick and so strong. And it's going to be very interesting to see how some of these planned innovation districts in Australia, you know, how quickly the likes of a Central Station in Sydney and that zone sort of really sort of evolve. So let me come to the research and where I'm at with it and what I take away. And I think it's hard to go back to, this is going to be a real cop-out as well. It's hard not to go back to my planning roots. You know, do good planning, and I think you kind of fix 80% of the problem or the potential problem. And, you know, that good planning, I mean, I could reach to 5 different resources behind me, you know, pattern language, smart growth manual. We've had them for decades on how to do good planning, you know, land use, mobility, housing, jobs, right? Plan communities and cities well. It's hard not to go back to that as sort of the policy response here. And then I wrestle with myself on, well, why aren't we doing that necessarily? I'm not saying we do bad planning in Australia, but I won't say that we're acing it either. And it's hard to go beyond just a reality that many kind of really don't want to sort of admit to, which is planning, urban planning, planning our communities and cities is often more a political process than a technical process. And you know, I'm here in Brisbane, largest local authority in the Southern Hemisphere. It's a planning beast. But you know, when you have council members, you know, that are approving PowerPoint presentations of planning processes before they go out to the community, you know that for good or bad or otherwise, there's bigger forces at play. And I'm not casting judgment on that, but what I'm saying is I think there's some issues like that often are barriers to that that sort of planning 101, you know, jobs, housing, land use, mobility sort of coming together. And I suppose that's why I'm attracted to, you know, the topic, because it's so intersecting, it's so conflicting as well. Finally, on smart cities, let's now lay in the idea that we have a thing called the internet, and that we can connect everything and anything, we can accelerate anything and everything, we can know anything and everything in real time if we want it. Not to mention the 3,000 new innovative solutions that are served up every morning when we wake up that are transforming everything from housing to mobility and everything in between. So I'm an urbanist that comes to the smart cities movement. So I'm a cities guy. But that's really served me well, because what gets lost in the dialogue is what smart cities is actually about. And I'm not talking to the report now, I'm talking more broadly within government and industry. We think smart cities is this sort of thing. Smart cities has 2 words in it, smart and cities. So fundamentally, it's a cities agenda. and it is merely the use of technology and data to help achieve what we want from our cities. So at times I think we put, as you rightly launched in your presentation, Robyn, from the outset, those buzzwords and how we treat those things. Innovation is apparently this separate, different thing. Apparently, smart cities is not a city; it's a smart city. They're these different things. So I also question sometimes, our approach to these. Are we forcing these concepts? Because if I took out the word innovation, if I took out the word smart from the research report, what we would have there is good, solid city planning. So some wicked challenges that we're trying to solve. And I think it's still a little bit early in my mind to work out whether smart is going to be able to accelerate some of those good outcomes we want, like ensuring that affordable housing becomes a reality for us in those sort of those growth areas and innovation districts. There's some sort of augmented elements or supporting elements to this, where technology and data does play a very clear intersecting role. For example, with how we build housing, the type of housing, the manufacturing of housing. We've been talking about modular housing, trying to reduce the capital cost of housing for years and years and years. And we kind of sort of, we do it, but we don't, but we do, but we don't. So I think there's still yet to be, in my mind, in Australia, a community or a precinct where we've kind of really nailed it, which is hard for us to learn when we don't have sort of a living example in our backyard. But as I said, I think there's a pipeline of some really interesting projects coming through. I'm a critic of these kind of comments, but unfortunately, I think this is one where more research is going to be required. I'm an action guy and I want things to happen, but I don't think I don't think we're kind of there yet. And I think the report is fantastic. I kind of like those touch and feel examples. When I can fly over to the UK and visit BedZ, one of the most sustainable housing developments in the world, I can walk through it, I can pull it apart. I think when politicians can touch and see those kind of things, it becomes really, really powerful. So I hope we get there soon. So again, Robyn, congratulations on the research. It was a great read and very stimulating.
Thanks, Adam. That's terrific. So we're starting to see some interesting questions coming through, and I'm going to go straight to the first one, which is really cutting to the chase and getting into the detail, I guess, or into a key example, and looking at the Western Sydney Aerotropolis, and asking, look, if affordable housing is left out of the strategic land use planning mix, and the intention is instead really on fostering a smart city and attractive, innovative businesses and so on, and encouraging employment. What will be the outcome of that? What are the downsides long term? Robyn, your research looked at this as one of the examples. So,
yeah.
So what are your comments on the future there?
Well, I guess we would get more of the same. I mean, I would think that the Western Sydney City Deal and the Aerotropolis is an opportunity to create something different, right? To start from a different starting point, to be tautological. And I just, this is an opportunity that we don't have a blank site because there are owners and land users there already, but there's a sense in which, we don't have to just repeat something. We're not trying to do an infill. We're not just trying to, whack up a bunch of warehouses. Like there is the scale and the investment that is in the Aerotropolis will allow us, if we can't do affordable housing or we can't incorporate that, then I guess if I put my university hat on, that would be just really disappointing. Like the opportunity and the focus and the investment and the goodwill, I think. So one of the things about the Western Sydney City Deal is that the collaborations amongst a whole series of partners that don't ordinarily collaborate. It's all there. So I guess I'm not answering what would be the urban outcome. I just think that the outcome for Australian urbanism would just be profound disappointment for residents and workers in Western Sydney who are very keen for it.
Adam, did you want to add to that?
What I would say is that, and this is easy to say, hard to do, but the moment there were or are lines on a plan and coloured zones and polygons from a land use perspective and sort of trunk infrastructure like transport perspective, why would we not be sterilising land from the private sector, hold it in government ownership so that we protect land for affordable housing? I mean, that's what Enterprise Community Partners does in the US. They scour the land, they find the TOD sites, which are going to be the most expensive ones, you know, right on top of mobility. That's where our key worker housing needs to be, our affordable housing needs to be. In Australia, for some reason, it seems to be the flip side. That's where sort of the highest priced apartments are. It's prime real estate. So, I mean, I'm not a policy person, but if you want to do affordable housing, you go and sterilise those sites, and you know, contractually mandate it. You know, as I said, I'm not a policy person. I don't practice planning anymore, but kind of good planning, right?
Yeah. There's another, well, it's both a comment and a question, I suppose, but another contribution particularly focused on Western Sydney. Starting off by noting a sense of dread at the concept of a gig city, where workers are in individual competition with each other to bid down to the lowest price for their labour, and the alarming implications for housing affordability that can generate. And wondering how innovation districts can fend that tension away. But also questioning, you know, I guess the location of Western Sydney Aerotropolis amongst relatively expensive housing and you know, in surrounding areas that are already established. So how do you address this in an already built up area? So Robyn, your case studies also looked at satellite cities, and I suspect that's part of the solution, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I guess I should just quickly clarify, the gig city concept was not the gig economy concept. It's actually like the gigabyte, right? It was much more, and I didn't make that clear, so my apologies. That's more about, you know, remember the early days of the NBN when everyone was really excited about what their bandwidth or whatever it was going to be. So that's what Cleveland were really excited about, that somehow they've got this very, very good digital infrastructure. So my apologies.
Good to unpack that.
But in terms of, you know, Western Sydney, and I mean, it's an interesting I mean, again, it's about, I think that most of our redevelopment and development sites are combinations of existing and non-existing land uses, and that is, it would be to garner some of, as Adam said, some of those sites that are not already developed for affordable housing, for example. But the other thing is to also just talk about connectivity. So one of the things, like physical connectivity as well. So that we know there is a large workforce available in Western Sydney. We also know that the university in Western Sydney has got a really successful accelerator program, coding, startup. So, and so it's not that they, you know, there are other parts of, if we connect our city more strongly, physically through proper transport networks, I'm going back to good planning again, or digitally, then in fact, it's not that you need to provide new affordable housing on site all the time, that you actually are connecting those jobs to people who live elsewhere. And one of the interesting things that we did in the project when we were talking to Wollongong, so, you know, as the crow flies, Wollongong and Western Sydney are actually not that far apart. But if you're doing public transport, it just takes you, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours. It's actually easier to get to the Sydney CBD from Wollongong than it is to get to Liverpool. So there's this, well, again, it's just like we can connect different pools of labour, if you like, that, you know, physically and digitally is one of the ways I would think about doing that.
Adam?
I don't know if I've got too much more to add to that. Robyn, I don't know if I'm going against the agenda here, but I was super keen on your closing comment there around this research being done pre-COVID. And and sorry if I'm stealing your thunder, Michael, but I'm so fascinated in your thoughts and reactions around sort of work from home now. You know, how much is going to stick? Are we going to flood back into the offices? Or has the innovation district sort of become, or the you know, innovation precinct become every lounge room now? Is there, because just as I see the million plans that have been done for Western Sydney, there's an element of me thinks that there's a part of this that's just been thrown up in the air again, you know, because the nation's been working from home, and there's jury's out on how many sort of stay there or not. But I'd love your thoughts on that, because it's kind of relevant to that last point as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the critical thing, is that the nation has been working from home. What is it that is long-term viable from working from home, and what isn't? So beyond, and so I'm just thinking. So you know, for example, I'm still working predominantly from home, but in the office. I'm really not happy being in the office, I have to say. But what I do value about being here is that serendipitous encounters. So I think the challenge is going to be, how do you create those encounters virtually, or how might you replicate those? And maybe so if I take another example that I find interesting, is that we might have these, you know, smart work hubs. So Oran Park, another, you know, suburban Western Sydney development, planned for, I'm not sure how it worked in practice, these places where people working from home could just pop in, right, for an hour or two a day to meet other people. So I think that's, so I think it's about the non-work bit of an office or another environment, would be my understanding, that will make people return, or will entice people to think that there are things I need to do beyond home. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, Adam, I'm always happy to hijack onto the sort of implications of COVID at the moment. Sitting in Melbourne at home, it's on my mind every day. So it's very much part of it, every consideration at the moment, isn't it? Robyn, another comment or question from you that's come through regarding the presentation. So you discussed the importance of flexible zoning to enable housing near jobs, but in practice, you know, mixed use zoning is overwhelmed by residential development demand to the exclusion of employment spaces. So do you have a suggestion on how we work through that problem? I didn't say they were going to be easy questions.
No. You know, change the property market. No, I have a simple. The questioner is exactly right. When you think about the dynamics of real estate in many Australian cities, highest and best use happens to be residential still. I mean, I'm speaking mainly from a metropolis perspective. Again, I think that I'm not necessarily going back to COVID, but if I go back to some of our interviews, I mean, it might be about that we sort of make home more like work. So that one of some of our interviews with the startups talked about, you know, you can't really run a business from your bedroom. COVID, perhaps people have been, but what they were trying to say is that I would love to just be able to base myself in my home environment, but act like a worker. So it is about, maybe we're having these more flexible sorts of spaces that allow work and home to meld a bit better. But other than that, I really don't have an answer. Yeah, because what you also find is that you find the commercial, so you get cafes, you get beer, that they're the other things that, and yeah, employment, especially, yeah, employment sometimes misses out. Don't have an answer.
I guess there are a few different questions here that I might try and draw into a theme, because I don't think we'll end up being able to go through all of them in detail. But one of them is really challenging the sort of the questions around affordable housing outcomes for key workers, but more broadly as well. You know, it requires a market intervention. It's beyond the scale of social housing in this country at this stage. So, you know, besides just sort of pushing people further out or into alternate locations, what are the best lessons we can draw from overseas on how to build economic centres or innovation districts with affordable outcomes? Is the satellite city still the solution? Is there another path that we haven't engaged with in this country that we've seen overseas?
I would say it's a combination. So, and some of the examples that Australian cities still have relatively pockets of redevelopment opportunity, for want of a better term. So again, if I use the Sydney example, I can see the Waterloo Towers from my office, you know, 1 kilometre from the CBD, adjacent to the Australian Technology Park, you know, various media, other businesses. So there are still opportunities in, you know, existing innovation places in Australia to actually just, you know, take it seriously, if you like, using some of the tools that Adam talked about and we found in the report. And I guess, and I'll come back to, and the report also said, you know, so I guess that's what we found in the report. What we also talked about is that I think what we think of as satellite cities is going to change over the next little while. I mean, it already is. So again, you know, people in Sydney are relocating themselves to Orange in the Central West, 3-4 hours west, which would have been unheard of 2 years ago, and really maintaining businesses. So, which is a bit like, I mean, Geelong is much closer to Melbourne than what that is. But I just think that the idea, I think, coming back to COVID, it's opened up our sense of what we can do. The problem is that some of these places are actually not as affordable as you would like. So it's, you know, we need to take the opportunities when they present ourselves, which is why I was a little bit strident about the metropolis. But, you know, this is a big piece of land with a big set of investment, but can we try to do it a little bit differently?
Adam, if we were to draw a couple of lessons from overseas in terms of smart cities implementation, what do you think they would be? What are we missing? It's a very broad question, I know.
Yeah, no. I go back to one of my favourite interviews on our podcast, which was with Kevin Martin, who's the Smart Cities lead, again back in the sort of the city of Portland in Oregon. You know, Oregon's got a very interesting history. You know, invented smart growth, invented the 20-minute sort of neighbourhood. One of few cities that put a growth boundary in place, and for most part of its history hasn't moved it. And just that alone creates a staggering outcome. You know, when you put a fence around and you go, every dollar's got to be within this fence, and you don't bleed it across the boundary, it's incredible what you can do. And Portland's, you know, 29th largest city in the US out of 9,500 cities. So doesn't necessarily have a lot of money. So again, I go back to this sort of good planning. But what I like about it from a smart cities perspective, Michael, is it's one of the most simplified approaches to smart cities I've ever seen and heard, which was sustainability, diversity, equity, and inclusion first, and then we'll work out how technology and data can help us achieve those outcomes. Like literally that simple, okay? Their smart cities agenda is entirely about diversity, equity, inclusion, and sustainability. You got to remember, technology and data have never been the barrier. They have never been the problem. They've never been the barrier. The hardest thing is, what do you choose? What do you invest in? Because, you know, the solutions are changing every morning when you wake up. The business models are changing. That's the hardest bit. But technology and data has never been a barrier. for those that have got an internet connection, of course. But I love those examples where it literally is simplified like that. It is wholly outcomes focused, and the outcomes are right-sized for that city. You know, Portland was becoming, because of the Silicon Valley factor, you know, it was becoming highly unaffordable. It was struggling with, you know, diversity and equity. It had a massive, and still does, has a massive homeless problem. Yet it's been the most livable city in America 4 times running. It was the biking capital of the US. It's had all these accolades. But I loved how they put outcomes for their city front and center. And it kind of then just became a process, well, of all the glory that the technology and data is, which ones can help us get more people off the street at night? Which ones can help us drive emissions down? See, when you've got the purpose, right? When you've got the purpose, the rest falls into place. And we've got more and more examples like that now. I mean, we've got too many, and I won't say that smart cities is a walk in the park in terms of a movement and agenda. It's got a lot of baggage. A lot of big global tech companies have stumbled over the years, you know, and all we ever sort of get drawn as for parallels to you know, Songdo and Sidewalk Labs and sort of, you know, these one-off projects. For every Sidewalk Labs and every Songdo, you know, there's 30,000 other examples where cities are genuinely using technology and data solutions to save taxpayers money to deliver better value and services. So don't tell anyone, but you know, 90% of the smart cities agenda is mindset. Okay, if you're going to continue forcing it as a technology agenda, you know, which brings risk and change and all those kind of things, if you're going to force it and you're going to lead with tech and data, I mean, good luck to you. That changes every single second. Get your outcomes and your values right. We want more affordable housing. We want less people sleeping rough. We want to drive emissions down. 70% of your smart cities agenda is done. You then put it back onto the private sector to see who can solve those problems quicker, smarter, cheaper.
So can I then hijack, and Adam, you might not, given that I know you represent a national or international organisation. I mean, so 2 questions. So I used a lot of Melbourne, New South Wales examples. So I'm wondering whether you can, from your Queensland base, think about some potential satellite or regional places that are doing that you think are interesting, or in the smart city space that are a smaller place that is purpose driven, as you say, because I completely agree with what you've said. I was just interested in what sort of examples you might point to in Australia.
Well, just in the southeast corner here, I mean, you know, if you go back 4 years when we started, you know, May 2016, there were about 6 cities in Australia that were saying they were doing smart cities. You know, Ipswich, Sunshine Coast, Adelaide, you know, and a couple of others. And fast forward 4 years, we've got about 188 catalogued over Australia and New Zealand today. And when I say doing smart cities, I mean they've got a plan, they've got a resource or a representative or a leader, and they've got some proof of concepts happening. So there's some places here where that are kind of in their 2nd and 3rd iteration. You've cited Sunshine Coast in your report. You know, again, some good textbook style stuff. Get a plan in place. You know, they did the living lab really well. They picked a street in Bullcock Street in Caloundra, and they said we're going to try a whole heap of stuff. You know, and a lot of it was, you know, those sort of IoT sensors and allowing them to understand what's happening in the public realm. So they started that. And then they've got a big CBD redevelopment, a greenfield CBD, which no other city in Australia's got, where they're now starting to scale. They've had a big infrastructure agenda, and I think that's provided a bit of their why and what and sort of values. It's a lifestyle region, it's a coastal region, but they want a, you know, new runway, connect to Sydney easier. You know, they want people to move from Sydney up to the Sunshine Coast, but you can still get back for work if you want. So Sunshine Coast is good. To be brutally honest, I think the city of Ipswich is doing something, that no other local authority in Australia is currently doing. and I believe B, will set the new benchmark for local government. The new mayor, who's been in the seat literally for 30 seconds, has built a transparency and integrity hub. Mayor Harding comes from state government in Queensland. She used to lead open data, and she's taken that into her approach with the city, and they've built a transparency and integrity hub. So this is a data-driven approach to building transparency and how ratepayers' money is being spent. Anyone can Google it right now. Transparency and Integrity Hub, Ipswich City Council, and they've opened the books on where they spend taxpayers' money. And I don't mean an annual report with a summarised table that has incomings and outgoings. I mean every cab ride, every flight, every device, every contractor. And their goal, that is purely focused around building trust. So trust and transparency is back in vogue, I've been saying. And I think it's going to be a really interesting exercise, because once you get down to that level of transparency, I think you can then make a genuine attempt in determining whether you're making a difference. Okay, if you've spent $4 million on the Smart Cities program, you've got to be able to ask the question, well, what did we get for that? What's it doing? What's the value? Did we get a 3 for, 4 for, 5 for? You know, was the multiplier 6 or 7? And we're seeing parts of, if I just quickly bleed out of Queensland into Northern Territory, I love what they've done with their My.Darwin app and platform, where they're now monitoring on a week-by-week basis the multiplier effect of their small cash contribution into a voucher program to help the community spend money in local businesses. It took them like 3 or 4 weeks to stand it up, and they're now getting quantitative data on the economic benefit of that, hard numbers, and more importantly, it's building a digital relationship between residents, small business, and the city. And one thing that I heard loud and clear during the peak of COVID, which is still going for some, is the lack of digital relationship between city, community, and residents, and being able to communicate quickly, identify what's happening where, because one data set that no one had and everyone wanted was which small businesses are closing down today and where are they? No one had that data set in Australia. So I'm actually quite excited to see what comes over the next 12, 24 months as local authorities get a new appetite for data. I think a number of cities have now realised that they're going to have to start procuring data. And I think that's potentially going to be part of maybe some new sort of planning and renewal ideas when it comes to suburban centres and things like that, where we've been hanging out a lot more than what we normally would.
Thanks.
Adam, your comments a few minutes ago on the secrets behind doing smart cities well, it's not about the tech, clearly resonated. A number of people chiming in with appreciation for what you were saying there. So hitting the right mark.
Yeah, and there is a caveat to that. We can't do it without tech and data. I just want to make sure that, and the tech and data providers will say the same thing. You know, lead with outcomes. We get a better brief. We'll be able to serve you better. So that mindset, and it'll flourish.
It's back to that sort of, you know, philosophy of science. You know, we should focus on why we want to do things we want to do rather than whether we can. You know, what's the purpose behind it? But coming back to some of the questions from the audience, there's a really interesting, I guess, philosophical question being asked about whose responsibility it should be for affordable housing to be a part of smart cities. You know, given that there are companies that are benefiting from that agglomeration, from the, you know, the intellectual capital that's raised through their participation in these districts, shouldn't they be responsible for providing affordable housing in the way that mining companies in remote areas are responsible for providing accommodation for often fly-in, fly-out workers? Where does the responsibility lie for provision of that? And I think that's a really interesting challenge. Robyn, is that something that the research picked up on at all?
No, it didn't, and it is. I mean, the FIFO example is an interesting analogy to draw. I think that, and in fact, what it did pick up on is that in some of, and I don't remember, some of the American big tech companies have actually started to provide housing, not out of a sense of altruism and responsibility, but as a way to actually get workers.
As a recruitment incentive. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. So I can't remember. Adam's nodding. He probably remembers the example better than me. So it's sort of that's a really, like, that's where some of the bigger companies have got to, is that we need to. There's an alignment of, well, we need workers. They want affordable housing. We can combine that together. But I think that, I guess I would be reluctant to. There's issues about how does affordability fit with other things that we get out of housing. And as someone who's done a lot of research on home, we know that in remote communities, you don't own your house, you probably don't have much control over a whole series of things. It's probably expensive. You probably have to pay for a lot of things you wouldn't necessarily, and that's not always the case. But it is about, how is it that we can provide affordable housing that allows people a sense of security and independence still? Perhaps I'm setting the bar too high here, but I don't see getting particular. But it is about, we can, using planning and other frameworks, get that gain, just like out of, say, transport. We do, we now try to extract some of the benefit that a rezoning might give to a particular landowner. Then maybe it is about, extracting benefit in indirect ways. That's where I would say responsibility lies.
And I suppose the proposition of a private entity covering or supplying housing for their workers is a different proposition for a Microsoft or a Google or a BHP than it is for a startup. So there are I guess maturity of organisation and scale of organisation questions in there as well.
But Michael, can I just add a comment to that?
Please.
That is an awesome question. Firstly, I want to say, however, I want to kind of, and I haven't been back there this year in 2020, but Australia's no Silicon Valley yet. Okay, so California housing problem, we're not there yet, and we got to remember that more than the majority, I'll be very kind, more than 70% of startups fail. So yes, we've got an Atlassian, but how many hands can we sort of count our really big sort of tech giants on? And maybe one hand. So we just need to be, that there is more wealth being created from property development companies, from tourism operators. So I think it's a great question. We've seen it in mining. I think remoteness is a key driver for that. All that I would say is we'd want to look at all sectors, not just, if we think a solution is to sort of slap a requirement on Atlassian that they got to put in 300 affordable housing units down at Central Station. There's probably another 70 similar approaches we need to take for other sectors as well. So I think it's important that we not overinflate the innovation tech thing. We're not Silicon Valley yet, I don't believe. I'm happy to be challenged on that. And we do need to remember that a large part of this sector, they're out of business within 24 months, 36 months. So it's
There's I guess a question of clarification that I might actually address myself, just asking the distinction between social housing and affordable housing, and are they really just the same thing? And it's probably a technical definition, and the AHURI website will cover this to a degree, but well, fairly exhaustive degree. Affordable housing is typically sort of based on a proportion of market rent, so typically sort of up to 74.9% of market rent available as a subsidised program. Social housing, on the other hand, is either provided by state government or through community housing providers with significantly lower rent, based on income, proportion of income, targeted at particularly vulnerable groups and low-income groups. So it is, I guess, a different part along the housing spectrum in this country. That's one of the questions that's come in from overseas during this session. So from an Australian perspective, that's the distinction we draw. I've got another question that's coming. That's a fascinating one which starts off by apologising for being a fine-grained question, but I'm not apologetic in relaying the question. I think it's a good one, and it's really looking at, I guess, statutory planning and dwelling diversity in a smart cities or innovation district context, and wondering whether a different framing of dwelling diversity is needed. So rather than thinking about a sort of a 2-bedroom and a 3-bedroom, with a few 1-bedrooms here and a few 4-bedrooms there as your diversity, could in these sort of locations we be thinking more in terms of the use of the dwelling, not just as bedrooms, but one bedroom and 2 study areas, which typically by local government would be classified as 3-bedroom. But in fact, the primary use in these districts will be oriented towards whether it's home business use or more innovative use. Is there a role for these focused areas to have a different kind of definition of diversity of stock? Adam, what are your thoughts on that?
Look, I in Queensland here, down on the Gold Coast, I mean, Lend-Lease did Varsity Lakes, I don't know what it was, a decade ago, and they built the Fonzie flats. There was sort of, living up top and work down below. And I wasn't really tracking at the time. I don't know what the driver was. It's not far from Bond University. It was a new development. And I mean, you look at that today and you just think it just kind of makes sense, doesn't it? But I imagine they had all types of planning problems trying to get sort of such a logical thing through. But yeah, I think I think that they're great, and just more flexible housing as well. I mean, I met a developer again back in Portland, Oregon last year for a conference, and they're a developer that now only does space neutral buildings. That's all they build, space neutral. So they'll respond to a tender for an office building or a residential building, but they build at no extra cost. They build into it space neutrality, so it can have sort of 2 or 3 other lives. So I really like that kind of thinking. I like the idea of flexibility. You never know when the next pandemic or crisis is going to hit or market's going to crash. So, and COVID's just sort of shown us that, schooling and working from home is probably a little bit of it's going to stick.
I completely agree. It's a great question, and I would add, you can circle back to Adam's comment about construction and manufacturing, and that's where the virtues of automated, flexible, just-in-time construction processes actually become really important. So it's quite a fundamental rethink of how, not only of the planning system, but of how we build and what we expect, what a wall is, is a wall movable, is it fixed? So it's actually, it's quite challenging, but a great way to, literally build flexibility as well.
Yeah, certainly my understanding of the real estate online portals lately have been seeing huge spikes in people searching for home office as part of their their real estate searches. Yeah. So I think our understanding of housing consumption has been nudged significantly in the events of this year. So it's in these districts, I think that's all the more likely to be the case. So it's an interesting area. I guess there's a final comment I might come back to that picks up on the earlier conversation. So in terms of responsibility for housing affordability in these locations, and suggesting that really starts with the land pricing approach that government take to these spaces. So is land price set for its social value or to maximise commercial return, and really suggesting that to date most of these releases have tried to maximise the return and the land value, and then address social outcomes. And I guess that is an interesting sort of reflection on your earlier comment, Adam, about putting the social outcomes first, you know, the sustainability and wellbeing outcomes first and the data to follow. Is that comment fair? Is the Australian experience of these districts driven by commercial return first and social outcome second?
I think I'd be naive to think that it was the latter. You know, if there's two things that Australia does really well, very crudely, is we dig stuff out of the ground and build houses. You know, I mean, you know, 2.5 hours ago, Josh Frydenberg got up in front of a graph and said essentially the same thing. So,
I think you meant to add cricket to that list.
Add cricket, yeah. But no, look, in all seriousness, I've been in the property sector sort of 25 years. There's been a significant change. You know, I'll be dead serious about that. There, many in the property industry, the social license to operate was taken very seriously. The sustainability movement. I worked at the Green Building Council for 4 years, and what I saw there was you can have your cake and eat it as well, in that you can make money and create amazing places where people can live and work. And what's beautiful now with that that movement is that the market values better more often. So through the GRESB ratings, the institutional investors, they want to park their money in sustainable property rather than unsustainable property. So we've seen some pretty big shifts from traditionally a profit-driven sector. Not saying it's ideal, and there's not more to do, but I do need to give that sector kudos. There are a number of players, a huge number of players that have totally stepped up and transformed the property sector. Now, on the affordable housing topic, not sure I can give the same praise yet, but that sector shows us that it can fundamentally transform for better social and environmental outcomes. It's been able to demonstrate that.
Robyn, I might give you the opportunity for a final comment before we wrap up. Were there any parts that we didn't get to in the questions today that you were thinking we might explore?
No, I would just quickly pick up on what Adam said then. And, you know, if you think about the history of some Australian residential property developers, I mean, Lend-Lease started as a residential property developer with a very, very strong social conscience. So, you know, we have a history of innovation, of social innovation in housing that, you know, hopefully hasn't completely dissipated. But that's what we'll need to sort of, you know, connect. Innovation. So think about innovation as social innovation is really what I'd say in affordable housing.
Terrific. All right. Well, look, we have reached the end of our time slot for the webinar today, and I do want to thank Robyn for your presentation and Adam for your insights today, and to all of you for joining us today. So please let me once more acknowledge the generous support of the Housing Industry Association as today's sponsor. And let you know that our next webinar is coming up in just a couple of weeks, and the invitation will be arriving in your inboxes later this afternoon. So join us on Wednesday, the 16th of September at 11 o'clock in the Eastern States, where I'll be joined by Professor Stephen Rowley of Curtin University, who's going to present findings from the final report, the just released final report on the uneven distribution of housing supply between 2006 and 2016. And I'm also really pleased to finally be able to announce to you the dates for the 2020 National Homelessness Conference to be held online on the 1st and 2nd of December. Now, of course, this conference was due to be held in Canberra last month, and the coronavirus, we had to postpone or cancel it. So as an online conference, we're going to adopt the theme, the year that changed homelessness. And in that, we will examine how the pandemic has impacted people experiencing or at risk of homelessness, public perceptions, and the unprecedented policy and practice responses we've seen in this truly extraordinary year. So I'd urge you to save those dates, 1 and 2 December, with registrations opening in the coming days. And also a quick reminder that we'd like your feedback, or we would genuinely welcome your feedback by completing a short survey that will be sent to you later today. Some of you may have received it already. And if you want to share this webinar with colleagues, it'll be on our website in the next few days. So until we see you again in person, thank you for joining us.